We've looked at 2007, 2008, and 2009 in gaming, and while a lot of people debate over which year was the best, clearly 2010 was the best year in gaming ever. Not that we don't say that for every year we do a video on. Still, 2010 was such an amazing year for gaming. So many great games came out on all of the platforms, and we thought it'd be fun to take a look back at this great year and look at some of the best games that had come out. So as always, I'm here with Luke, and today let's take a look back at 2010. First, we can't deny or ignore the fact that in 2010, Modern Warfare 2 had just been out for a couple of months, and the gaming community around this game were so hyped, and as this game was a huge industry changer because multiplayer became more of a forefront than ever before, especially with first-person shooters. And the hype continued when Call of Duty Black Ops was announced to release later on that year. And when Black Ops released, it kind of seemed like the hype train continued on. Sure, there were people who stuck with Modern Warfare 2, but a lot of people jumped on with Black Ops for the first time, and this game really refined the zombies gameplay that was introduced in World at War and made it much bigger and just greater and just expanded on a lot of things. We can't forget that Call of Duty Black Ops had an amazing single-player experience. It was really a narrative-driven story that kind of just pushed the envelope more so than even what Modern Warfare had done at that point. Black Ops felt like a complete package, and it was really nice to see back in 2010. But then also, we had Rockstar release Red Dead Redemption, which was pretty much Grand Theft Auto with horses and cowboys, and it was really fun. This game took on the known concept that Rockstar had done in the past in open world sandbox games and translated it into a different era and really developed it into something that stood great on its own, and it led for a great experience for a lot of people, and there's no denying that this game literally created the hype that turned into Red Dead Redemption 2. Of course, we can't forget Red Dead Revolver from back in the day, and this game was a good spiritual successor to even that. Then we had Rock Band 3, and Rock Band 3 was really interesting because while it seemed like the rhythm-based games were kind of dying around this time, with Rock Band kind of taking a year off to focus on doing something different, Rock Band 3 felt really refreshing with how they introduced a store where you could buy music, and it was kind of just the definitive version of Rock Band. They added new types of pro instruments that let you actually play the songs in real life if you plugged in a MIDI controller, and that was really awesome also, and it just kind of was like one final hurrah to the rhythm genre for a long time, at least until Clone Hero finally came out. We can't forget the release of Skate 3, which was such a fun skateboarding game, and of course people debate whether or not it was better than Skate 2 or not, but at least it was a new experience, and there was just so many new parks that you could take your skateboard to. I think for the most part people had a pretty good time with this game. We also saw follow-ups to certain games that had been around for a while or that were one-time games that we didn't really expect sequels to, but we saw sequels to Lost Planet and Lost Planet 2, which was actually a pretty fun game if you were just kind of looking for something extra to pick up. And Mafia had a sequel that was really unexpected just because Mafia was originally a really unique period-based game, and they kind of did that again but branched into several different decades, and it was kind of cool how they took that on and developed an interesting story out of that.
And while you can argue which Call of Duty was the high point of the series, to me, for the Battlefield franchise, it was always Bad Company 2. We did a separate years later review on this game a while ago, and we do have to say it still holds up very well. While the first Bad Company game was already really good, this one felt like a more well-rounded version of that game. And in 2010 they also released the Bad Company 2 Vietnam DLC, which was also really good. And what made Bad Company 2 a little bit more special to me than the first one is that it also released on PC and on Steam. The game Metro 2033, based on the book with the same name, also released in 2010. This game had a really unique setting and story. While we have seen like these kind of apocalyptic Chernobyl kind of games before, this was made unique by the whole metro system of Moscow being the main location where the game takes place. The gameplay was fun, is still fun, it is still a great narrative, and it got 2 more sequels which were also really good. Then another game released in 2010 that we also did a years later review on, and that's Mass Effect 2. You should go check out that video because it's still very fresh. We just did it a couple weeks ago, and honestly I think this game was the peak of the Mass Effect franchise as a whole. But if you want to hear more of my thoughts, just check out the video we did. And sometimes the sequel being the exact same game as the first one works out well, as you can see with Bioshock 2. Bioshock 2 didn't do too much different. It was exactly similar to the first one when it came to gameplay and setting. What made it unique though is that you're playing as a Big Daddy. Those were the enemies you fled from or you fought in the first one, and now you're playing as one of them and get to see their perspective, which made the narrative of the game stand out so much more. We also saw Medal of Honor 2010, which was a reboot of the franchise, and to this day I am still not sure if I like this game or if I don't like it. There's parts and bits that I like about it, like the setting was alright and the gameplay felt okay, but at the same time it never did anything different that we hadn't seen in Call of Duty or Battlefield before, and it was just kind of this mediocre game out there. Honestly, I'm still not sure if this is Hall of Shame worthy or not. I do know that the sequel is much worse though. Also, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit came out. It was a callback to Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit and Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2. Don't ask me how that works, but the Need for Speed franchise is not really relevant anymore, and I feel like this were still like the good times of Need for Speed. Not as good as Underground 2 and stuff like that, but it was still decent.
But if you're an Xbox owner, you also had some other games to get excited about. We had Alan Wake, which was like a movie translated into a video game. The way they took the game and developed a suspenseful action horror game and the flashlight elements, it just kind of felt like you're in an episode of The Twilight Zone. We also had Crackdown 2, which was a follow-up to a game that a lot of people really liked in the first one and kind of had this cult following around it, and Crackdown 2 did a lot of things right that people were really excited about. And then if we look into the Xbox Live Arcade side of things, which was kind of an emerging genre at this point, we saw Limbo, which was this creepy platform game that kind of showed that indie games can be taken seriously and can create suspenseful and atmospheric types of art styles incorporated into their games. And I think this was maybe a turning point for indie games just because it felt more of like a work of art rather than just a standard platforming game, and we really did appreciate that. And then another indie game that also released was Super Meat Boy, which kind of went more in the retro route but just made a really solid platformer, and the music soundtrack that came out on the Xbox version of this game was just so amazing. It's one of the best soundtracks from a video game ever, and the gameplay was extremely addicting too. Then we had Halo Reach, which was much anticipated because it was Bungie's final Halo game, and they really went all in this prequel game that takes place right before the first Halo game. Being a part of the Noble team in the campaign was great. This game was loaded to the brim with features too. We had a huge Forge world, custom games were more customizable than ever, and there was firefight mode on top of just the regular multiplayer and campaign that was offered, and then you could go back and record stuff and take pictures in theater mode. So this just felt like the ultimate Halo experience. Customization was on point, and of course we can't forget Invasion mode, which is often forgotten in Halo, was so much fun getting to play as Spartans versus elites in a game. That was so cool, and we really did appreciate what Halo Reach did, and it's finally coming out to PC and to the Master Chief Collection, so that's great. We're excited to play this one again. And then we also had Fable 3, another major first-party game release by Xbox and Microsoft, and Fable 3 was really cool because it took the elements from the first two Fable games and refined them and did a lot of new things and just kind of changed like how much impact you had on your world in that game, just because you kind of had power and you could do a lot of different things. And while there were some criticisms that maybe it wasn't as good as Fable 2, it's still a great game on its own, and I think a lot of people still jump into this game. And then we can't forget Doritos Crash Course. We did a whole video on it, no one seemed to notice, but this game was so much fun because it was a free platforming game that was like Ninja Warrior, and you could jump on with your friends, co-op, and race your way through the game, and it was just, free games were kind of a newer concept back then. It wasn't as common as it is today, and we really did enjoy our time playing Doritos Crash Course.
Now we get to everyone's favorite part, which is me talking about PC games because, you know, upon release in 2010, Amnesia: The Dark Descent already sold a good amount of copies, but it got a really big push when the game became one of the most popular video games on YouTube in 2010 and 2011, thanks to people like PewDiePie playing it. There's a huge cult following, and besides there being a ton of custom maps for the game, it got a sequel in 2013, was released on PlayStation 4 in 2016, and just last year came to Xbox One. And even almost 10 years later, this game is still really influential to the horror game genre. So remember when I said earlier that we already had similar settings to the Metro games before, minus the whole Metro thing. But what I really meant was, the Stalker series has already done it. With already 2 games released in 2007 and 2008, Stalker Call of Pripyat was the 3rd game to the trilogy, and honestly, I always thought the whole trilogy was underrated and were some of the scariest and most atmospheric games I've ever played. Call of Pripyat is the best and most definitive version of the franchise, having the most interesting story with the whole Ukrainian government launching this operation, with a great atmosphere, which I thought was only rivaled by the Chernobyl one, because Chernobyl is such an infamous and unique location that everyone knows what it looks like. But it also improved on a lot of the RPG mechanics in the game, and that's why I really like Call of Pripyat, even though not many people probably know this series anymore. Next up, we have Final Fantasy XIV. When the new Final Fantasy game was set to be a subscription-based MMO, people were kind of split at first. The game not having enough content upon release didn't really help the case either, but I do have to give them credit since they continuously updated the game and added new content, and I just recently learned that this game is still relevant in 2019. I even saw an ad for it in theaters when I was watching Endgame last week. Part of me is still split on whether I wanted a Final Fantasy MMO or not, but for what it is, I think it's a pretty good game. Talking about games that are still relevant today, StarCraft 2 sure is one of them. Still one of the most fun real-time strategy games out there with 2 great add-ons. And the game had to follow up on a lot since StarCraft 1 was on top of the real-time strategy genre for 12 whole years. It took them 7 years to develop this game, and it was a true sequel to the first one. And now another thing that Blizzard released in 2010 was World of Warcraft Cataclysm. We already talked about World of Warcraft add-ons on these lists before, and Cataclysm was another big add-on for World of Warcraft. While only increasing the level cap by 5 this time, not adding any new classes, and just including 1 secondary profession, it still had a great story, added interesting raids, and for a lot of people it was the last really great World of Warcraft add-on for a long time, since the next one would be a weird Kung Fu Panda tie-in, I guess.
And there was still more hype coming from Nintendo. We had Metroid Other M, which wasn't as good as the Metroid Prime trilogy and had its criticisms, but I mean, at least it was a Metroid game, and we never really got another main Metroid game for a long time afterwards. And looking back at the game now, it's definitely not as bad as people said it was when it released. Then we had Pokemon Black and White, which was really one of the most unique Nintendo Pokemon releases in a long time. Pokemon, for the most part, was getting kind of overcrowded with how many Pokemon they were introducing, and it was entering new territory with Black and White, and in a way they kind of did a soft reboot of the game by only introducing around 150 new Pokemon and kind of forced players to use these new Pokemon. And while there were some criticisms about Black and White, it was actually really interesting because it reintroduced players to that feeling we had the first time we stumbled across a Pokemon we had never seen before in the games. Instead of just being able to use the Pokemon you were familiar with, you were forced to use something different. And the story in Pokemon Black and White was actually really good, and it made you think about what you were doing as a Pokemon trainer. Unfortunately, I don't think they'll ever do anything in the scope that Black and White did, just because a lot of fans kind of turned away from this game just because it changed so many things. There's a very, very dedicated fan base that really appreciated Black and White for how it did things differently. And then the biggest thing that we were excited about was Donkey Kong Country Returns. It was finally a return to form for Donkey Kong, and it was so nice to see because honestly the first 3 Donkey Kong Country games were just really great. And while Donkey Kong made the shift to Donkey Kong 64 in the N64 days, and he had some other bongo related games later on, it was really nice to see kind of a revival of that 2.5D side-scrolling adventure, and the game was done really well.
There's 2 more 2010 Nintendo titles that I wanted to personally talk about. The first one being the second entry into the No More Heroes series, No More Heroes 2 Desperate Struggle, which was a great follow-up that improved the already fun combat in a good way and gave us a character arc and more depth to Travis Scott. Also, you were able to play as characters like Henry or Shinobu, which were bosses in the first game, which also was really cool to see this callback. And people are still waiting for No More Heroes 3 all these years later, and I do mean a true No More Heroes 3. The last Nintendo title from 2010 that we're gonna talk about today might have been the biggest one of that year too. I have to confess that Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 are in my top 5 best Mario games of all time. I know that's totally subjective, but I always thought these games were so good. Mario Galaxy 2 was released in 2010 and was met with positive reviews, and to me it seemed like a great follow-up to the first one. There was more galaxies, more endgame content, you could play as Luigi later in the game, and they made the travel between galaxies a lot quicker and easier too. Honestly, if there's one game I could pick for Nintendo to bring back to the Switch as like a deluxe or remastered, I would pick the Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 games. Now getting into the PlayStation side of things, there's only 2 games we really want to talk about. The first one being God of War 3, which released in 2010 and was the final chapter in the God of War trilogy. For some reason I always felt like each God of War game had one specific thing that it did best. God of War 1 had the best story, God of War 2 had like better variety between story and gameplay, and God of War 3 had the best gameplay out of the trilogy so far. While this game overall is a great package, there was always one major criticism about the game, that it was just kind of short. Nonetheless, this is a lot of people's favorite God of War game up until maybe the new one came out, which is also really good. Sony thought so too, which is why they remastered it in 2015, and it's kind of odd if you think about it, because the game picks up right after God of War 2, and if you haven't played that, you're kind of missing out. So it's just kind of weird that they would remaster the third one, but not remaster the first 2 ones. Nonetheless, this might have been the best PlayStation 3 game from 2010, maybe being rivaled by Heavy Rain. And while I know a lot of people liked Heavy Rain, I never really could get into it. But there was one more game from 2010 that I thought was really good, and it's not a PlayStation 3 title, it's a PlayStation Portable title. I always thought the PlayStation Portable was kind of ahead of its time. It brought us great spin-offs to beloved franchises we knew from home consoles: Dexter, God of War, Chains of Olympus, and the 2010 Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. They were all pretty damn good games for a handheld spin-off, and it was just something I've never really seen before, because before, when I thought of handheld spin-offs, I always thought about those shitty Game Boy ports from like licensed games. Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker took the best parts from the Metal Gear franchise and actually scaled it up a little. The story was interesting as always, the gameplay was translated well into the handheld format, and the game was so good, just 1 year later it got a HD remastered on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, because they knew they could make more money with it.
But now guys, it's our favorite time of these videos where we enter the Hall of Shame, where we look at some of the worst things we saw in 2010, and of course, Guitar Hero, Warriors of Rock. Oh boy. Guys, you remember earlier we said that the Guitar Hero thing was kind of, the rhythm games were starting to get a little bit oversaturated? Well, Guitar Hero kind of hit that point with Warriors of Rock. They hadn't taken a break with Guitar Hero since it became popular in the beginning, and people were so burnt out of rhythm games. Guitar Hero Warriors of Rock was just kind of that last nail in the coffin that just made people get over what Guitar Hero had been doing. Rock Band would continue to kind of be the more popular game for years to come and the go-to rhythm game just because of their store, but yeah, Warriors of Rock was not that good.
Our second entry into the 2010 Hall of Shame is Dark Void. Does anyone remember this game? I'm gonna go on a limb and say probably not as many people remember this, because there's not much to remember about it. When they showed Dark Void off at E3 2009, it got a lot of people hyped actually. The concept of a World War II fighter finding himself in another dimension was interesting at first, and it sounded like an engaging story, but as soon as the game released, it was clear that Capcom could not deliver on the hype. The graphics were just mediocre for the time, the gameplay was clunky as fuck, and the writing didn't really deliver either. But this is all overshadowed by one of the biggest failures in video game history ever. 2010 saw the full release of APB All Points Bulletin, which was a game that costed $100 million to produce, making it one of the most expensive games of all time. Now, this game was a complete failure from start to finish. It released in June 2010, and in August 2010, they announced that they have to shut down the service because the studio went broke. So then an online games company, K2 Network, came in from the UK and bought it for like $2 million. They bought the $100 million game, one of the most expensive games of all time, for $2 million. But even after the purchase, nobody knew if the game is ever gonna come online again, until it launched in 2011 as a free-to-play game, and then it was shut down again, and now you can buy it published by EA or something. So the game is still released in some form later on. It just failed as a whole nonetheless. It never reached any cult following, it never reached a huge player base, nobody ever wanted to buy it, and now it's one of the biggest failures in gaming history. And that is how we're gonna end our 2010 video. We hope you enjoyed the video. Let us know in the comments down below, what was your favorite game from 2010? Did we forget any games? Just let us know. Also make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and check out the videos on your screen right now. We'll see you guys next time with a brand new video.